So which are the strongest big bugs and monsters that the Tyranids can field? Let's talk through 5 of the best. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd revisit the swarms of the Tyranids once more, and in this video I thought we'd talk through some of the strongest monsters of the swarms and what people are tending to run competitively for the Tyranids right now. Tyranids generally tend to be an army of swarms on monsters, and the balance between the two of them and all of the medium-sized bugs certainly has ebbed and flowed over the additions of 40k. We've had additions where monstrous creatures for the Tyranids were kind of awful, but also times when fielding just about entirely monsters was the right way to go, say for example with the fearsome Crusher Stampede in 9th edition. For 10th edition, for competitive Tyranid lists, it does seem that the monstrous creatures are still getting a good look in. The trend for quite a lot of armies seems to be to go at least fairly monster heavy at the moment, either have a fairly balanced swarm with a whole bunch of little bugs, then maybe 4 or 5 big critters, or to go fairly heavy in Nidzilla, with the vast majority of the force being monsters. I thought it could be interesting to see what people are taking in practice, and do a very slightly data-driven top 5 monsters in the army, looking at 10 successful Tyranid army lists, either going for 1 or better at grand tournaments, or 3 and nil or better at road trader tournaments, and seeing which monsters were most commonly taken. Hopefully there's more good stuff to come on the way for the bigger Tyranid creatures as well. In the next codex there is supposed to be a detachment themed around monsters. It'll be interesting to see what sort of options they can gain from that. Firstly, before getting into the top 5 proper, I thought we'd just mention a few of the more common picks out there, ones that seem to have made their way into 3 or 4 of the top 10 lists but haven't made it into more than half of them. It seems that a fairly common competitive choice at Old One Eye with some attendant Carnifex guards. Both of those were taken in 3 out of the lists. Carnifexes still have more flexibility than the vast majority of Tyranid monstrous creatures, maybe not quite as crazy options as they had in 9th, but you could still certainly spec them out for either range or melee. If you do want to have a little bit of extra shooting, you can back them up with spine banks and a bioplasma attack, with perhaps slightly a mix of some melee weapons and then something ranged to back it up. I feel like maybe Old Worn Eye is really the thing that's driving them to get taken though. Hitting on a 4+ for the standard Carnifexes does feel a bit sad. Old One Eye is basically the very tanky regenerating Carnifex who gets the 5+ feel no pain type save. His melee is particularly powerful with a whole bunch of attacks that damage d6+1, and he also re-rolls hits for the entire unit that is leading as well, turning Carnifex damage output from something really quite tame into something fairly good. Another more common pick is the Scythed Hierodule for 305 points, and it kind of shows that this guy is doing rather well if he's a more niche Forge World bug, and is still being taken really quite a lot despite his model being harder to get hold of than most. This guy's kind of similar to the Tyrannofex, toughness 12, a 2+ save and 18 wounds, though nowhere near as tanky per point. This guy costs loads more and doesn't get the -1 damage. He also comes with a similar sort of acid spray type flamer attack, damage 1 rather than the Tyrannofex's damage 2. But unlike the Tyrannofex, this guy hits with an enormous amount of melee hits, 10 attacks at strength 14, AP -2 and damage D3+3. That's truly enormous combat damage for the points I think. Really not bad for 305 as he sort of rivals Knight stat lines for how hard they fight in combat. It's rare to see stat lines in 40k that can handle just about anything that's thrown at them. That amount of attacks at that high strength and damage is just very general purpose. It will make big dents in anything from a lightish infantry unit to the heaviest things in the entire game. For its defensive profile though, it isn't super standout for the cost. Maybe does run the risk a little bit of being shot down early. Next up, the standard Trigon seems to be making its way into competitive lists a little. It was selected in 3 out of the 10 that I looked at. I'd say its base stats are okay but not super overwhelming. 12 attacks at strength 9, AP 2 and damage 3 plus a small shooting attack. And its defense for the 180 points isn't really very good at toughness 10, 14 wounds and a 3+ save. Any dedicated anti-tank will go through that quite quickly. I think the Trigon might be being taken as a bit more of a utility monster though. He can deep strike just outside of 3 inches of enemy models. That's really quite a helpful ability for getting secondaries like behind enemy lines or maybe deploying teleport homers, or you could use it with rapid ingress as well. Potentially have a Trigon pop up somewhere really quite annoying in the enemy backfield, somewhere where it can't be shot by the majority of the army, and then in your turn go and feast on some easy prey. Finally, and taken for 4 selections out of these 10 top lists, we have the Neuro Tyrant, 105 points and really quite a cool model out of the Leviathan box, though it seems that things like the Screamer Killer with its rather high price tag and the Psychophage aren't really convincing people at the moment. It seems that at least a few lists are fielding him without Neuro Gaunts, though I still think it's not the worst idea in the world. It basically just can put him at a bit of a liability, where if the opponent targets you with a very powerful high volume shooting attack, you might be making really quite a lot of saves on the Neuro Tyrant that your opponent only had to wound against a toughness of 3 for. If you get targeted by a spectacular burst of anti-infantry firepower, you could maybe lose the last few Neurogaunts and also the Neurotyrant itself without ever having to roll against the toughness 8. Overall, I think it's not too bad though. For a cheap monster that amps up the Shadow in the Warp with an extra -1 to the leadership test, that can potentially have some game-wide effects and hopefully annoy a whole bunch of enemy units for a turn. And then he backs that up with a Psychic Flamer type attack, which could be okay for Overwatch, and also helping other units be within Synapse range. I certainly don't think it'd be worth taking more than one, but one seems to be an okay include in competitive armies. Moving on to the top 5 most taken monsters though, and in joint 4/5th place we've got the Haruspex with one other. Perhaps not too surprising to see the Haruspex here, 125 points for a really scary melee brawler, and for its cost it's got decent enough durability as well. I thought just for a bit of comparison we could look at the amount of las cannons or crack missile shots needed to down each monster. It's 4 or 5 las cannon hits to take down 100 points worth of Haruspex, or around about 14 or 15 crack missile shots to do the same. That seems to be at least somewhat mid-ranking out of the other options. Obviously the main thing about the Haruspex with its enormous feeding more is its melee weapons. It both can have 14 attacks with anti-infantry profiles of strength 7, AP -1 and damage 2, then also shoveling claw attacks with the extra attacks profile, and they land at strength 14, AP 2 and damage d6 +1. It's just a crazily generalist melee profile that's far better than any monster or vehicle I think in all of 40k at that point's cost. Obviously it's only ever good if it gets there, but in general that's a threat that most enemy units just really aren't going to be able to ignore. I think it averages around about 5 Dead Space Marines in 1 round of combat, and can do plenty to vehicles as well with that big strength 14. On top of that he also gets a fun sniper attack with his grasping tongue that could potentially drag a character down with a big damage d6 +1 if he gets lucky. And he also has a Battle Shock special rule as well, which is maybe the weakest bit of the datasheet. Your turn Battle Shock isn't really all that great, besides potentially blocking some fight phase stratagems, or potentially a little bit of end turn scoring if it's relevant for secondaries. Overall, looks like people are considering the Haruspex solidly competitive, but maybe not auto-include. More competitive lists taking it than not, but not everyone. Next up, and also on 6 selections, we have the mighty Tyrannofex, 200 points worth of sheer Tyrannid durability here. This thing is kind of standout tough, a massive 12 wounds, a 2+ save and 16 wounds, all for 200 points, which isn't really all that much. It's less than the cost of several Lehman Russ variants, for example. And then on top of that it's got its -1 damage rule, which will be particularly effective against anything damage 2 or damage 3. All of this comes together to be even pretty godly defense against things like anti-tank weapons. To kill 100 points worth of Tyrannofex, you need to land around about 7 las cannon hits or 15 crack missile hits on it. Both of those are the best durability for the points, and you could certainly use that 5+ feel no pain type save stratagem if you really wanted this thing to laugh off the vast majority of damage. For its weapons, I would say that despite some fearsome stat lines, it's certainly slanted a lot more to durability than damage. It gets a flurry of Stinger Salvo attacks at strength 5 AP 0, and then for its main gun, most people are choosing between the Acid Spray or the Rupture Cannon, with the majority going for the Acid Spray. This one gives you d6 +6 auto hits at strength 6, AP 2 and damage 2, so quite nice for melting any medium infantry in the midboard. This one in particular can be a very strong Overwatch threat as well, if the opponent just moves up a cheap infantry unit to try and contest an objective. It is perhaps a little bit limited in scope though, it's not going to do all that much to say things like vehicles or things that are toughness 7 or higher closing in on it. Otherwise, a couple of lists took the Rupture Cannon. This one certainly got the potential to hit very hard if it's got the right target. 2 attacks at strength 18, AP 4 and damage 2d6. Certainly sounds scary on paper, and you could remain stationary for the heavy to hit on a 2+, though a lot of the time you're usually just going to be forcing 1 save on an enemy vehicle, and it can be countered quite well with invulnerable saves, and maybe command rerolls on the opponent's part at that kind of damage profile. Certainly a great big threat for tanks if you think that you've got anti-infantry things well covered, but does seem very swingy and all or nothing compared with some profiles. Moving on, and our joint 3rd and 2nd most popular monsters both had 7 selections out of these 10 top lists, and first up we have the Maleceptor. The Maleceptor is the psychic Tyranid brain bug that was famed in 9th edition for just belting out a rather obscene amount of mortal wounds at close range. Still seems that he's pretty dangerous in 10th though, having a good balance of both durability and damage output for his cost. Toughness wise he's T11, a 3+ save and 14 wounds, but he's significantly better than other Tyranids of a similar weight class as he gets a 4+ invulnerable save against ranged attacks, and that means against the las cannons in particular he's the 2nd most tough bug on this list, just after the Tyrannofex. In reality as well as even tougher against melee as well due to his Encephalic Diffusion special rule. This one's a debuff for any enemy units within 6 inches of him, a -1 to hit and also a -1 to wound if they're less than half health. Might occasionally be helpful for debuffing ranged things that are adventuring forwards, but I think the most likely time it is to come up is when he's actually charged himself. That could actually save him a lot of damage. Then in terms of his own threat, he's got a fairly general purpose big psychic blast, d6 plus 3 shots hitting on 3s at strength 10, AP 2 and damage 3, very nice for killing medium or heavy infantry or lighter vehicles, and unlike the Tyrannofex he does actually have some okay quality melee, not quite as big a deal as his shooting attack, but a few attacks at strength 9 with damage d6 plus 1, or a more anti-horde sweep attack with 6 attacks at strength 7. These guys seem to be very popular right now as a tough bug to have on the front line that can take a punch. It seems like almost the ideal monster to get charged by the enemy and to take that initial hit, perhaps more so than other monsters. I guess it doesn't really hurt to have more synapse in the front ranks as well. It's another unit that can keep you passing battle shocks and giving you boosted options for your stratagems. Also, with 7 selections out of these 10 strong lists, we have the Exocrine. The massive great big dedicated gun bog is perhaps the least durable per point out of any of the ones here. I still don't think that he's awful for 135 points, 14 wounds at T10 and a 3+ save. Seems fairly standardish for tanks in Warhammer 40k, and he does at least pack a fair bit of threat with that. I guess more so than the rest, he can afford to be a little bit further back, so he'd more have to fear longer ranged anti-tank weapons as opposed to close range things in combat. He attacks with his bioplasmic cannon, d6 plus 3 attacks, hitting on 3s at strength 8, AP 3 and damage 3. It does have the blast keyword for more attacks against big squads, and it also is heavy as well, so if you can stay stationary it hits on 2s. The AP 3 will be quite nice against a fair few targets that might have been saving on higher numbers otherwise. Really quite nice against Space Marines and Terminators and the like, and certainly could punch up a bit against vehicles, either wounding on some 5s or maybe with lethal hits if you've taken that adaptation. It's never really a gun that's going to be too inefficient against virtually anything that it targets. On top of that, he's also useful for focusing Tyranid firepower. His symbiotic targeting thing means that if you've hit an enemy model, then you get to reroll ones to hit against it with other things targeting the same unit, so one Exocrine could spot for another 2, or could spot for things like Maleceptors or Rupture Cannon Tyrannofexes. Overall seems like a very solid Tyranid gun beast to have on the battle line. Finally, that leaves us with a single top monster selection, and while it looks like there is at least a bit of debate between your Haruspexes, Maleceptors and Exocrines and things, the single most popular Tyranid monstrous creature at the moment is the standard Hive Tyrant, the walking one on foot. He seems to be the go-to choice as opposed to the winged Hive Tyrant at the moment. The on-foot Hive Tyrant costs 220 points. He was taken in 9 out of these 10 top lists. Seems very near enough to be an auto-include monster. The one that didn't decided to go with the winged one instead. He certainly seems to be a monster that you don't really want on the front lines. His durability is fairly weak per 100 points just due to his big points cost. To kill 100 points worth of the model, it's either 3 las cannons or 5 crack missiles, which is the worst on both metrics. Despite that, it looks like at least the majority of lists are fielding him without Tyrant Guard at the moment, though a few take some along. Maybe just deciding that it's better to just play carefully with him and try and have him lurking out of line of sight and most important guns, rather than to pay the extra to have him shielded by a few more ablative wounds, though it doesn't look like that's unviable. The Hive Tyrant does 2 major things for the Tyranid army. First, he gives you a 0 CP stratagem on 1 Tyranid unit within 12 inches, and that happens per turn as well, not just battle round, so it seems that you could both do that in the friendly and the enemy turn. Perhaps the best use of that one will be the 5+ feel no pain type save. Seems very nice to have on a monstrous advance, and if you did want to make your monster spectacularly durable on the assault, you could potentially have that going off on 2 different Tyranid units at the same time, one with the Hive Tyrant and one with your own command point buy-in. I suppose Overwatch could be another interesting enough option if there was a fragile enemy infantry unit that you really wanted to try and fry with a big shooting bug. He also gives the Tyranids an aura of the assault keyword, and that means that you could get quite a lot of your monsters far forward and in range if you needed to. That seems like it would pair really quite nicely with things like the Tyrannofex and the Maleceptor, both of which are going to struggle a bit with their 18-inch range on their shooting attacks. Between that, I feel like he wants to be somewhere in the midst of the monstrous advance, but not right on the front line due to his poor durability, and hopefully trying to hide one of his prongs behind cover at least, so you get a +1 to your save on that already good 2+. Where he does make combat, he does have a little bit of his own threat as well, though I'd say it's maybe not the most driving thing out of this. Most people seem to run him with the heavy venom cannon with a few shots at strength 9 and damage 3, and then the monstrous bone sword and lash whip in close combat, strength 9, AP 2 and damage 3 with a twin linked keyword, which I guess does mean that he's going to be at least fairly reliable at stacking wounds on tough things as well as lighter infantry. Most vehicles are going to be scared of him making a charge on them. I guess it's probably the free stratagems that are the biggest draw to this, and he could also be one that you could use different enhancements on. You could give him a native feel no pain type save with that adaptive physiology, and there's a few other good tempting ones out of the Tyranids roster. So anyway, let me know your thoughts on your favourite monsters to be running for the Tyranids army at the moment in Warhammer 40k. Look forward to hearing all your thoughts and insights on which of the bigger bugs are working out well for you on the table right now. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones every day, and I'm sure we'll have more for the Tyranids in the future. Finally, if you have been enjoying the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.